Okay, so Dwayne, thank you so much for being here and joining us at Plume this afternoon on the heels of our interview for the June issue where you were the special feature. And we had just wrapped up our interview and then the nationwide protests started happening in the wake of George Floyd's death. And so, we had talked about kind of carrying on this conversation. I think most of us in the poetry world and as writers know you as a poet, and we of course know that you're a lawyer as well. But I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit more about that the legal part of what you do in life and how that intersects with poetry.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, um, a few ways, I guess. It's kind of interesting because we write about the world that we live in, and so it's very easy to think of somebody like to think about Ross Gay and how his work is so infused with what he feels about nature and the land and this idea of like gardening, right? Or Afar Weaver, and I think about how his work is really so infused with aspects of the Chinese culture that he's been studying for decades.
Mhm.
And it's also apparent in other folks too. Tahim Bajet's work is really infused with that love of music. He almost like a musicologist. And yet, when you think about the law, since it's so sprawling and it could be so many things, people would think first that my work is about maybe prison before thinking about how the law and its study and a preoccupation with it, like sort of textures what I write and how I think. And in this book, I was trying to find ways to really push on that and show how it's the law itself that's making me. Um, I'm trying to push at some different kind of understanding of the law and the work. And so, if you think about the redaction poem specifically, it's obviously apparent in those because I took legal documents and I redacted pieces of those documents to turn them into poetry that spoke with the voice of the people. And I've done that with historical documents as well, like I did it with the Fugitive Slave Act. But I think another way in which my work tries to get at the same thing that I'm getting at with my study and practice of the law is this pursuit of freedom, and this pursuit of peace and justice in the society that we live in. And so it's a lot of poems that try to get at that, and they get at it in different ways. But a lot of times it's something underpinning it, some legal principle that's underpinning, what it is that I'm writing about.
Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of community in general in your work? We talked a little bit about it in the interview, the various shout outs, but that's just so woven into your work.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I feel like I don't necessarily think it's new. I think it's a part of how I think about hip hop, though, how I think about music. And I mean, look, I blew my mind a few months ago, a few weeks ago, maybe. I found out um, that Dolly Parton wrote "I Will Always Love You," and she wrote Jolene "I Will Always Love You" on the same night, which is just mind-boggling. But the idea that she wrote "I Will Always Love You," and I grew up thinking that that was a Whitney Houston song. There's a way in which our obsession with um with identification ruins our ability to actually identify.
Hmm.
Because Dolly Parton always was credited as being the writer of that song. But the reason why we didn't know that it was Dolly's song when Whitney Houston sung it is, I think, because it's a resistance to acknowledge the way in which this influence is working back and forth. Because you could imagine a different conversation that happened back then that would have like increased, not just that would have increased, would have been a reemergence of part and a recognition of the way in which a country song becomes this iconic R&B staple, right? So I think my work is trying to do that. My work is doing the same thing that's always been done, but I'm hoping that when people read it and they get at it, they recognize in this sort of commonality. I mean, one of the jokes in my head is that, you read the long poem Bastards, the title poem in Bastards of the Reagan era, and, you say, this is like really gritty, street language. And I'm like, yeah, but some of it came from, Homer. Some of it came from Brodsky. How are these stereotypes going into play? in this conversation that we're having. And I think that's part of it. But then the other part of it is just it gives me kind of joy. It's like I'm revisiting my people. You know, when I go back to those lines, when I say, I have braved for want a wild beast still cages. That's me revisiting Brodsky and recognizing that he had a line that truly captures a lot of what I think about the prison experience. And so it's a few things going on at once, but the whole point of it is to say that how can you create community on a page? Well, one way to do it is to invite and use the illusion as a really relevant tool in the broader scheme of tools that I use as a writer to really lean on that.
So as poets and writers, right? I mean, I think we all, at some level, want to move people, and maybe I think both their hearts and minds. But then legal writing too is also a really, in some ways, I mean, it is a really different kind of writing, but persuasion is equally important. And so,
Right.
I just wonder what your thoughts are on that in your own experience. About kind of, you're in a unique position to look at it from these two different
Yeah,
perspectives.
it's actually interesting because like I worked for a federal judge, and so I had an opportunity to draft some opinions, and that's a very different kind of writing where you try to do both things. You're trying to persuade, but you're also trying to explain. You are trying to speak with the voice of a judge, which is so different from the voice of an advocate. And through that job, I had to read like so many petitions, and that you see what the defense attorney is doing is so different from what the prosecutor's doing. But I think the poet is like the judge. You know, the poet is supposed to come to the page trying to do all of these different things, but it's not supposed to sound like you have a policy position as a poet. Well, the defense attorney, they got a policy position. They coming at you as if, and even when they line up arguments for the other side, they're like, and you might believe X, Y, and Z, but of course that's also wrong. My friend suggests that his client is not culpable for these reasons, but and then you knocking down all of those reasons. Whereas the poet sometimes has to admit something different, and the poet has to chase something different. So I think the judge has to too. Sometimes the judge actually has to. I read opinions where what was going on was foul, but it was no clearly established precedent. And so what a judge would have to do is, put people on notice in this case, because it was like a thing in a first instance. And so you can't really hold somebody accountable for this thing in the first instance, but now you can, one of those type of situations. So I think the poet is like the judge, and legal writing is like poetry insofar as you're trying to persuade, but it's unlike poetry insofar as the defense attorney, the prosecutor, people who have like a demand to be zealous advocates for their client don't necessarily need to do justice. And I think the judge is always supposed to be out to sort of do justice, and the poet is out to do justice.
So I wonder if you might read one of your poems to kind of close out.
Yeah, I think this is yeah, I'm gonna read this one. For the city that nearly broke me, a woman tattoos Malik's name above her breast and talks about the conspiracy to destroy blacks. This is all a fancy way to say that someone kirked out, empty 5 or 6 or 7 shots into a warm body. No indictment follows Malik's death, follows smoke running from a fired pistol. An old quarrel, crimson against concrete, and the officer's gun still smoking. Someone says the people need to stand up, that the system's a glass house falling on only a few heads. This and a stop snitching adds out of conundrum, and damn all that blood. All those closed eyes imagining Malik's killer forever coffled to a series of cells, and you almost believe them. You do. Except the cognac in your hand is an old habit, a toast to friends buried before the daybreak of their old age. You know the truth of the talking, of the quarrels, and how history lets the blame go blameless for the blood that flows black in the street. You imagine there is a riot going on, and someone is tossing a trash can through Sal's window, calling that revolution. while behind us cell doors keep clanking closed, the Malik's casket door clanks closed, and the bodies that roll off the block and into the prisons and into the ground keep rolling. And no one will admit that this is the way America strangles itself.